He looked like just another old man begging with a trumpet. People laughed, tossed coins, and walked away. But the moment he played the army hymn, the entire square froze, and nothing would ever be the same again. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, and let's listen to this story together. On a crisp Saturday morning, the city square was alive with motion. Street vendors shouted over one another, the scent of roasted coffee mingled with fried dough, and tourists snapped photos in every direction. At the far end, near the worn steps of the old courthouse, sat an elderly man named Harold Whitman. His shoulders were stooped, his clothes plain and slightly frayed, and at his side rested a battered trumpet case with faded stickers from decades past. Harold eased himself onto the cold stone step and pulled out his trumpet. Its brass finish was dulled and tarnished, the kind of instrument most people would assume belonged in a pawn shop. He adjusted his grip, his hands trembling faintly, the veins along his forearm visible like old river maps. A few passers-by glanced in his direction, then quickly looked away. To them, he was just another aging street performer, hoping for spare change. A pair of teenagers walked by and chuckled. "Man, look at that thing. Doesn't even shine anymore," one whispered. Another, smirking, tossed a coin into the open case with exaggerated flair, as though making a joke. A couple sitting on a bench nearby shook their heads in quiet disapproval, muttering about how sad it was to see someone so old reduced to playing in the streets. Some avoided eye contact altogether, pulling their coats tighter as they hurried past, unwilling to acknowledge him. Harold didn't respond. He never did. He simply lifted the trumpet to his lips and blew a few soft notes, shaky and uncertain, testing the reed, adjusting the pressure of his breath. The sound wavered in the cool air, and a few more people scoffed, as if their low expectations had been confirmed. To them, it was just noise background clutter in the symphony of the square. Yet, there was something different in Harold's eyes. They were not the vacant eyes of a man begging for coins, but sharp, steady, and tinged with memory. When the sunlight caught them, they almost glimmered with unspoken stories. His posture straightened slightly as he rested the instrument on his knee, gazing past the crowd as though he were looking at something far away, something no one else could see. The chatter of the square continued. No one knew who Harold Whitman really was. No one could imagine the weight of history in those trembling hands, or the power waiting in that battered trumpet. To the crowd, he was invisible, just another old man fading into the noise of the city. But within minutes, when he finally chose to play, the entire square would learn how wrong they had been. The square bustled louder as late morning turned to noon. A fresh wave of shoppers and tourists filled the cobblestone paths, weaving between food carts and souvenir stalls. Amid the clamor, Harold Whitman remained in his corner, trumpet balanced across his lap, waiting. The few hesitant notes he had tested earlier had already shaped the crowd's opinion of him, and the whispers only grew harsher. A young couple pushing a stroller slowed to glance at him. The husband leaned toward his wife and muttered, "Poor guy, probably washed up. He should be in a retirement home, not embarrassing himself out here." The wife gave a sympathetic shrug, tugging the stroller forward. Their toddler, however, kept looking back, fascinated by the glint of brass. Not far away, a group of college students gathered near a fountain. One of them, wearing a baseball cap turned backward, pointed toward Harold. "Check this out, free entertainment." He mimicked playing an imaginary trumpet, blowing raspberries with his lips, while his friends erupted in laughter. They looked at Harold the way one might look at a sideshow attraction, something to ridicule, not respect. As the ridicule grew, so did Harold's silence. He gently polished the mouthpiece of his trumpet with a handkerchief, ignoring the snickers. Each movement was deliberate, as though he were preparing for something far greater than the crowd could comprehend. His stillness only irritated a few people more. A businessman in a tailored suit, balancing a phone call and a coffee, snapped in annoyance as Harold tested another low note. "Can you not? Some of us are trying to have a conversation." He barked before striding away without waiting for a reply. For many in the square, Harold's presence became an inconvenience. He wasn't lively enough to entertain like the guitarists or the jugglers, and he wasn't invisible enough to be ignored completely. He existed in an awkward middle ground, too noticeable to blend in, too underestimated to be respected. Then came the cruelest moment. A teenage boy, emboldened by the laughter of his friends, stepped forward and kicked Harold's open case, sending the few coins clattering onto the pavement. "Play something real, old man," he sneered. The crowd gasped softly, but no one intervened. A few even smirked, relieved it wasn't them being humiliated. Harold slowly bent down, gathering the scattered coins with care. His movements were steady, without anger, without shame. He placed them back into the case, then closed it softly, as though sealing away something unimportant. His face betrayed no irritation, but his eyes, those piercing, weathered eyes, seemed to look through the boy, through the crowd, through time itself. It was in this quiet defiance that a few began to notice something unusual. A middle-aged woman standing nearby whispered to her husband, "He doesn't look like a beggar. Look at the way he holds himself, like he's waiting for a command." Her husband, skeptical, shook his head. "Don't romanticize it. He's just another street musician." But not everyone agreed. A man in his late 30s, wearing a ball cap with a faded military insignia, had frozen mid-step when he caught Harold's eyes. He recognized that look, though he couldn't place why. It was the look of someone who had seen things most people never could. Still, the square returned to its rhythm, drowning in chatter and commerce. For now, Harold was a background figure, a source of mild irritation or fleeting curiosity. No one suspected the storm that was about to break, not from the weather, not from the crowd, but from the first powerful note of a hymn that could silence an entire city. Harold raised the trumpet slowly, placing it against his lips with the precision of a man who had done this countless times before, not for coins, not for applause, but for something deeper. His breath steadied, his shoulders squared. The moment of truth was only seconds away. The square hummed with ordinary noise, footsteps clacking on stone, hawkers shouting, pigeons fluttering above the fountain. Then, without warning, a single note cut through the air, pure, strong, unwavering. Harold Whitman had raised his trumpet and let the first sound ring out. It wasn't the shaky, uncertain testing from before. This was different. This was deliberate. The tone was rich and commanding, as if the very brass carried authority. People closest to him turned first, startled by the sudden shift. Conversation stuttered into silence. The square, a moment ago so loud, seemed to lean in to listen. Harold's breath steadied, his chest expanding with practiced rhythm, and the melody began to take shape. It was not a jazz riff or a popular tune the crowd expected from street performers. It was something older, heavier, with meaning, the army hymn, played with reverence and power. The notes lifted into the open air, echoing against brick buildings and flagpoles, pulling every wandering ear toward their source. A veteran in a wheelchair, passing with his daughter, stopped dead. His hand rose instinctively to his chest, pressing against his heart. His daughter turned to him, confused, but saw the tears gathering in his eyes. That's the hymn," he whispered. Across the square, a young soldier in uniform carrying groceries froze mid-step. The first bars of the tune struck him like a command. He straightened immediately, heels together, shoulders back, as though standing in formation. People around him stared, puzzled by his sudden rigidity, until they too recognized fragments of the melody. Harold played on, his hands no longer trembling but sure and steady. With each note, the years seemed to fall away. He was no longer an old man, sitting forgotten on courthouse steps. He was once again the young bugler who had stood on foreign soil, sounding the hymn for brothers in arms who would never return home. Every breath he gave to the trumpet carried memory, sacrifice, and honor. The crowd shifted. Those who had mocked him earlier now stood silent, their laughter frozen on their lips. A businessman who had barked at Harold for disturbing his phone call now slipped his hat from his head, eyes lowered. The teenage boy who had kicked the case shrank back, cheeks red with shame, unable to look away. The music swelled, powerful and unrelenting. Mothers held their children closer, whispering explanations about respect and history. Some tourists pulled out phones to record, but even they lowered their devices after a moment, realizing the sanctity of what they were witnessing. By the time Harold reached the middle passage, the square had transformed into something sacred. Dozens of people stood with hands over hearts. Some veterans in the crowd, men and women wearing old jackets with patches and pins, snapped to attention, saluting toward the source of the music. A hush fell so deep that even the birds above seemed to pause, circling quietly without their usual coos. The melody climbed higher, Harold's chest rising with effort, but the power never wavered. His face flushed with the exertion, but his eyes blazed with purpose. He was playing not for applause, not for pity, but for remembrance. Every soldier he had known, every comrade buried under foreign skies, was alive again in those notes. A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, why is everyone so serious? Why is he playing that song?" The father, his throat tight, whispered, "Because that man is not just a street musician. He's reminding us of the soldiers who gave everything." When Harold reached the final refrain, something remarkable happened. Without cue, voices began to join in. A handful of veterans near the fountain sang softly at first, their voices rough with age. Others picked it up, men, women, young soldiers, even strangers who barely knew the words but hummed along. The hymn rose above the square, carried not only by brass but by dozens of human voices bound together in respect. Harold closed his eyes as the last notes approached. His hands moved with precision born from decades of repetition, his lungs pushing out every ounce of breath he had left. Then, as the final note soared into the sky, the square stood in perfect stillness. For a moment there was no city, no market, no division, only unity, bound by music and memory. The trumpet lowered slowly from Harold's lips. His shoulders sagged, his body frail once more, but the fire in his eyes had not dimmed. The hymn was complete. The silence broke not with chatter, but with a thunderous wave of applause. People clapped, cheered, some wept openly. Soldiers saluted, civilians bowed their heads, strangers embraced. The entire square had been transformed by a song and by the man they had once dismissed as invisible. For Harold Whitman, it was never about coins. It was about reminding them all, some sacrifices are too sacred to be forgotten. The applause thundered across the square, rolling like waves that seemed to shake the very stones beneath Harold's feet. Yet he did not bow, did not reach for the coins or the outstretched hands. Instead, he rested the trumpet gently on his lap, closing his eyes as if savoring the silence after the storm. His breathing was heavy, but calm each inhale and exhale, carrying the weight of years gone by. Slowly, the applause softened. People edged closer, forming a circle around him. The businessman who had shouted earlier stepped forward first, guilt etched across his face. He removed his suit jacket, folding it over his arm, and with a voice stripped of arrogance, said softly, "Sir, I owe you an apology. I thought you were but I was wrong." Harold lifted his eyes, studied the man for a long moment, then gave a small nod. No anger, no resentment, only quiet acceptance. Then came the young soldier who had stood at attention. He placed his grocery bags on the ground and raised his hand in a crisp salute. His voice cracked with emotion. "Sergeant?" He hesitated, unsure how to address the stranger. "Whoever you are, thank you. You reminded me why I wear this uniform." Tears welled in Harold's eyes, though he blinked them back quickly. "Not for me, son," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "For those who didn't make it home." Gasps rippled through the circle. The words hung in the air, clarifying what many had already begun to suspect. Harold Whitman was no ordinary musician. He was a veteran. His posture, his bearing, the reverence with which he had played the signs had been there all along. The teenage boy who had kicked his case earlier lingered at the edge of the crowd, shame burning his cheeks. After a long hesitation, he stepped forward, picked up the scattered coin he had knocked loose, and placed it carefully back inside the case. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered, barely audible. Harold's eyes softened as he placed a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "Respect," he said simply. "That's worth more than coins." A middle-aged woman, her hands trembling, knelt in front of Harold. My brother served in Afghanistan. We lost him 5 years ago. Hearing that hymn again, it felt like he was here with me. She broke down, her tears spilling onto the cobblestones. Harold leaned forward, grasped her hands gently, and murmured. Then the song did its job. By now, dozens more had gathered. Veterans wearing faded caps and jackets embroidered with patches had appeared from across the square. Some had tears streaming down their cheeks. Others stood rigidly, saluting the man on the courthouse steps. It was as if Harold had called them all together, not with words, but with music. The once dismissive chatter of the square had vanished. Food vendors stopped hawking, tourists stopped posing for photos, even children hushed. For that moment, the marketplace had become a place of memory and reverence. Harold's hymn had changed it into something closer to a chapel than a city square. One of the veterans stepped forward, his voice breaking with pride. Whitman, Harold Whitman, right? You played with the 2nd Infantry Band back in '68, didn't you? I remember your face. You played taps for my company. Harold's eyes flickered with recognition. Slowly, he nodded. Too many times, he said softly. Too many times. The crowd fell silent again. The weight of those words pressed on everyone present. Suddenly, the old trumpet wasn't just an instrument. It was a vessel of history, carrying echoes of battles, funerals, and brotherhood that most would never understand. And in that silence, a realization dawned on all who stood there. They hadn't merely stumbled across a street musician. They had been given a gift, a reminder of sacrifice, honor, and the cost of freedom. The crowd stood in silence, reluctant to let the moment end. Some still wiped their eyes. Others held their children close, as though wanting to pass on the weight of what they had just witnessed. Harold Whitman sat quietly, the trumpet resting across his lap like a trusted companion. His hands no longer trembled. The years of loneliness, of being overlooked and dismissed, seemed to fall away in the warmth of that circle of respect. One by one, people began to approach, not with coins this time, but with gratitude. A woman placed a small folded flag, something she had carried from her father's service, into Harold's case. A man left behind a handwritten note. Thank you for reminding us who we should never forget. None of these gestures were for performance. They were acknowledgments, tributes to the man, and to the countless others he represented. A group of veterans stepped closer and formed a line. Each saluted Harold in turn, their movements slow and deliberate, heavy with meaning. Some of them had not stood that tall in years, but in that moment, they did. Harold returned each salute with a nod, his expression both humble and proud. The teenage boy who had mocked him earlier returned once more. This time, he stood straight, removed his cap, and whispered, I didn't understand, but I do now. Harold's tired smile was filled with forgiveness. That's enough, son. Understanding is all I ask. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the square, the people lingered, unwilling to let Harold fade back into anonymity. Yet Harold seemed content. He had played his song, and the message had been received. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his knees stiff but steady. Gathering his trumpet, he looked over the crowd and spoke just once more. I'm no hero, he said quietly. I just play for the ones who can't. The words struck like a final note, resonating in every heart. The applause that followed was softer than before, gentler, almost reverent, but no less powerful. It was the sound of a community promising not to forget. Harold walked away slowly, his figure small against the backdrop of the city, but to those who had been there, he would never be invisible again. They had thought he was a nameless street musician, a forgotten old man. Now they knew better. What remained was not just the echo of a hymn, but the reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms forever. Sometimes they sit quietly among us, waiting for the right moment to remind the world of what truly matters.